Welcome to this Bible prophecy study. Jesus said, "Now I tell you before it comes, that when it is come to pass, ye may believe that I am he." John 13, verse 19. The book of Revelation puts much of its message in word pictures, and we've tried to include a few visual aids. The illustrations used in these classes are often dramatized artist interpretations, and as such, are sometimes not exactly correct in every detail. Revelation chapter 12. This is part of the second set of 7 chapters, which covers the last 7 years, the tribulation, and the rapture. Chapter 12. The church in tribulation. Verse 1. The two main characters of this chapter are a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars, and a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns. Both of these wonders are appearing in heaven. So this is more or less a spiritual look into things that will happen during the end. Verses 4 and 5. And the dragon stood before the woman which was ready to be delivered, for to devour her child as soon as it was born. And she brought forth a man-child, who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up unto God and to his throne. The woman here represents the church, who throughout Revelation is called the bride, the Lamb's wife. Revelation chapter 19, verse 7, and chapter 21, verse 9. The church consists not only of the New Testament, but also the Old Testament believers. Moses and the children of Israel are called the church in the wilderness in Acts chapter 7, verse 38. This prophetic portrait of a woman giving birth to a man-child, 1, is based on the literal birth of Christ, and 2, has had many intermediate spiritual fulfillments both before and after Christ, and 3, will have one ultimate spiritual fulfillment. Number 1, the literal fulfillment. Mary, who was part of the church, or woman, was used by God to bring forth Jesus, the man-child. Immediately after his birth, the dragon, or devil, through King Herod, tried to devour him by ordering the slaughter of all children under 2 years old. It's Matthew chapter 2, verse 16. And Jesus has been caught up to God's throne to rule all nations. Mark 16, verse 19. 2. The intermediate spiritual fulfillment. This also represents the church of all ages, giving spiritual birth to new revolutionary movements throughout history of dropout saints. They overcome the world by dropping out of the established religious system and becoming as little children, that they might enter the kingdom of heaven, suffering that they might reign with Christ. Matthew chapter 18, verse 3, 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 12, and 1 John chapter 5, verse 5. As Jesus said, "To him that overcometh will I grant to sit with me in my throne, and to him will I give power over the nations, and he shall rule them with a rod of iron, even as I received of my Father." Revelation chapter 3, verse 21, and chapter 2, verses 26 and 27. Number 3, the ultimate spiritual fulfillment. Since this chapter is dealing with the end time, this woman represents the final, ultimate church herself, the one who will live in this end time period, the ones who will be complete overcomers and rule all things with Jesus in the millennium. Verse 6. This next verse proves that this woman, or church, is living in the end time. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she hath a place prepared of God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. Just as specific as it can possibly be, here is our 3.5 years of tribulation again. 1,260 days. And to make it easy for us to remember it, the Lord put it in chapter 12, verse 6. Now, if the woman is the hero or heroine of this chapter, who is the villain? It's the dragon, who in verse 3 tried to devour her child as soon as it was born. A lot of people insist that this dragon represents China, the great red dragon, and China is certainly not friendly towards Christianity. However, the Lord makes it very clear in this same chapter as to who these verses are referring to. Verse 9, it says, the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, just as plain as day. It's amazing how people can misinterpret things, either through spiritual pride or simply because they don't read the passage carefully. The dragon, with his 7 heads and 10 horns, bears a great resemblance to the beast, or government, with 7 heads and 10 horns in the 13th chapter. But the dragon is not the beast. It very clearly says in the next chapter, chapter 13, in the 2nd verse, that the dragon gave him, the beast, his power and his seat and great authority. So they are 2 distinct but very similar personalities. In other words, the Antichrist government of this world is practically one and the same with the devil himself. And God allows it in order that we should have some kind of order, even if the devil runs it. Where there's no government, absolute iniquity and violence rules, as in the days before the flood. And since mankind generally rejects God's rule, the only other option is the devil's rule. From verses 1 to 6, we have a capsule history of the church up to the time she flees into the wilderness for 1,260 days. Verses 7 through 14 now give us a little more detailed explanation of why she flees into the wilderness. Verses 7 and 9. And there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought and his angels, and he prevailed not. Neither was their place found any more in heaven. And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceiveth the whole world. He was cast out into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. The scriptures teach that Satan and his followers fell from their first estate or position at the beginning of creation. For how the devil fell, you can read Ezekiel chapter 28 and Isaiah chapter 14. However, Satan still continued to have access to heaven and the Lord's throne. In the book of Job, written a couple of thousand years after creation, it says, the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them. Then he began to accuse Job to the Lord like a prosecuting attorney. You can read this in Job chapter 1, verses 6 through 11. So the devil has been in heaven a long time, even after he rebelled against God. But now, at the very end, he finally gets the gate and he's cast out of heaven to the earth. He comes down and possesses and empowers the Antichrist, who will then become literally the devil in the flesh, accusing the saints face to face and making war against them. Verse 11, and they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimonies, and they loved not their lives unto the death. Even as he is overcoming the saints physically by killing them, they will be overcoming him spiritually by keeping their faith even unto death. Verse 12, therefore rejoice, ye heavens, and ye that dwell in them. That's because the devil is no longer in heaven. But woe to the inhabitants of the earth and of the sea. For the devil is come down unto you, having great wrath, because he knoweth that he hath but a short time, only 1,260 days. Verses 13 and 14. And when the dragon saw that he was cast out unto the earth, he persecuted the woman which brought forth the man-child, and to the woman were given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness, into her place where she is nourished for a time and times and half a time from the face of the serpent. Well, here it is again. A time, times, and a half. 3.5 times. Here's our 3.5 years of tribulation, spoken of in the 6th verse as 1,260 days. And now in the 14th again. Is God going to care for and nourish or feed his church during that terrible time of tribulation? Absolutely. Even if he has to drop manna out of heaven or cause angels to feed us, as he did for the children of Israel and many of the prophets in their wildernesses. This wilderness may be some specific location, such as the rock city of Petra, or a lot of different places. But more than likely, though, it represents the total separation of the church from the systems of the world during these last few years. Many will become martyrs and die for their faith to be a witness to others, but God will care for the church, and there will still be multitudes to meet Jesus when he returns. Verse 15. And the serpent cast out of his mouth water as a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away of the flood. The Word of God is called the water of the Word. And if someone is filled with the Spirit and witnessing God's truth, the Bible says, out of his belly shall flow rivers of living water. John chapter 7, verse 38. Well, if living water of truth comes out of our mouths, what comes out of the devil's? His water, his word, is always lies. When he speaketh a lie, he speaketh of his own, for he is a liar and the father of it. John chapter 8, verse 44. So he casts after her a flood of lies, lying propaganda, to try to swallow her up. And believe you me, an awful lot of Christians have already just about been swallowed up by this deluge of lies. Not just trivial fake news, as it's called today, but also deeply deceitful big lies, such as evolution and even some of the lies of atheistic materialism. In the long run, though, if they're really saved and want the truth, God will have mercy on them and bring them to the truth, one way or another. But as for all the others, the ones who really swallow these lies, or those whom God shall send strong delusion, that they might be damned, because they received not the love of the truth. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 10 through 12. So who is that? The unsaved who heard the truth but rejected it. Verse 16. It says here, the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened her mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon cast out of his mouth. The earth is a type of the worldly people, and the very fact that they're swallowing all these lies ought to help us realize that they're not the truth. They, the devil's prophets, are of the world, earth, the system. Therefore speak they of the world, and the world, the systemites, heareth them. 1 John chapter 4, verse 5. In Bible prophecy, we find certain repeated symbolisms, such as governments symbolized as beasts, kingdoms as mountains, kings as horns and or mountains, etc. So also the earth is used as a symbol of the peoples of the world. The symbolism here also accurately shows the two general categories we see in people. It's the difference between the unsaved and the wicked. The unsaved are simply unsaved, and it's our job to tell them the good news of the gospel. But the wicked are those that know the truth but have rejected it. This accounts for the earth doing two different things. One, swallowing, meaning believing the flood of lies, which is not good for God's people. And two, others who are willing to help the woman, the church, in the wilderness. Some people we will meet in the wilderness will not be a part of the system, the one world government, and they might help us. Other more worldly people will have accepted the Antichrist as God and his mark, as we'll read about in the next chapter, chapter 13, in order to preserve what is left of their lifestyle at the cost of their soul. The devil wants to be God, and he wants the world to worship him. When he finally possesses the Antichrist, it says in Daniel that he abolishes all other worship, and he sets himself up as God and demands the world to worship him or die. The devil and the Antichrist will at first try to flatter and tempt the woman to worship him with his lying promises, but being rejected, he will then set out to kill her. Verse 17. And the dragon was wroth with the woman, and went to make war with the remnant of her seed, which keep the commandments of God, and have the testimony of Jesus Christ.